writing this script, I thought, what can I say about Obi Castle and the surrounding area of modern-day Nichinan City? Well, I can certainly say it's a lovely place to visit, well preserved and well looked after. It's nice to see the whole area cohesively looked after in a way that I found Obi to be. It's well worth visiting. The castle was founded by the Sumochi clan, but for a long time the castle was fought over by the Shimazu and the Ito clans for nearly 100 years. This was the longest battle of ownership in Japanese history until eventually it was handed to the Ito clan in 1587. This was a reward for their efforts in helping Toyotomi Hideyoshi in his Kyushu campaigns as he sought to dominate Japan during the Sengoku period, or warring period as we would translate it into in English. The Ito clan's alliance with Hideyoshi's forces handed them the castle, and they would remain custodians until the Meiji Restoration, which leads me to continue picking at the threads that I was remarking on my trip to Cape Sata, where I talked about the Satsuma Domain. Whilst it's impossible to tell the story of the Meiji Restoration and do it justice in such a short video, I can bizarrely make a connection between Obi Castle and its associated Obi Domain and where I used to live in Miyako in northeastern Japan in Iwate prefecture. The Meiji Restoration saw the Tokugawa Shogunate that ruled Japan from 1603 to 1868 overthrown when power was restored to the emperor in Japan. The Meiji Restoration is so named because it literally restored the emperor Meiji to power, though much of that power was delegated to the so-called Hanbatsu or Meiji oligarchy. The Obi Domain, of which Obi Castle was a part of the Tokugawa Shogunate's so-called Han system. In short, these Han were effectively administrative divisions. A Han was the domain of a daimyo. The daimyo were feudal lords, and this system existed for all of the Edo period, which was concurrent to the Tokugawa Shogunate, and for a short while during the initial Meiji period. However, they were soon abolished by prefectures and prefectural governors, though not the same modern-day 47 prefectures of Japan, but the same kind of idea. Obi was one such Han, and for 14 generations the Ito clan ruled the Obi Domain after a successful campaign to overthrow Miyazaki Castle on behalf of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would become the first shogun of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Towards the end of the Tokugawa Shogunate, influence from foreign countries was beginning to exert itself in Japan, which resulted in the opening of ports within Japan and therefore trade with foreign countries again. It's long and complicated, but even before the Tokugawa Shogunate was overthrown, some factions within Japan were pushing for modernization or essentially embracing certain Western technologies and sometimes customs, nominally for defence-related purposes, but in other ways as well. Naturally, this created a lot of friction that would occasionally lead to spilt blood and civil war within Japan. One of the strangest occurrences in the story was the unlikely partnership between the Satsuma Domain and Britain. After the killing of British merchant Charles Lennox Richardson in the so-called Namamugi Jiken, or Namamugi Incident, named after a nearby village. Richardson was slain for a lack of respect to Shimatsu Himamitsu, the regent of the Satsuma Domain, who was passing through the same area. Great offence was taken by his bodyguards by Richardson's party not dismounting their horses as requested. In turn, this led to the British bombardment of Kagoshima Bay in 1863 as revenge. The British Royal Navy attacked the Satsuma Domain and seized ships in an attempt to try and extract reparations for the slaying of Richardson. Houses were destroyed, 3 steamships were sunk, as well as some of those ships being taken as bargaining chips from the Satsuma Domain. However, the bombardment could not be sustained, and the British Royal Navy retreated. The negotiations with the Satsuma Domain resulted in the payment of £25,000, which the Satsuma Domain borrowed from the Bakufu, the government of the time, or the shogunate essentially. The fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate meant that this was in fact never repaid. An unexpected outcome of all of this, the entire Namamugi incident and the bombardment of Kagoshima, was the Satsuma Domain expressing its admiration of the British Navy, and in time a friendship was struck up, resulting in something of a military alliance and the purchasing of ships and military equipment from Britain in keeping with the Satsuma Domain's general vision of embracing modernization through adoption of Western technology and sometimes customs and ways. To cut a much longer and much more interesting story short, the Satsuma Domain, along with the Kyushu Domain, which they were allied with, overthrew the Tokugawa Shogunate and therefore the existing governance of Japan and returned it to the imperial court. In effect, the British were somewhat allied to the Satsuma and Kyushu forces and therefore the imperial cause, whereas France was somewhat allied to the Shogunate and was supplying its military. What had happened in other parts of the world where Britain and France were vying for power and influence was now happening in Japan. The Boshin War ensued, which lasted from 1868 to 1869. This was a civil war fought between the imperial forces and those loyal to the shogunate. By 1869, the imperial forces were the victors. During this war, the Obi Domain, which was allied to the Satsuma Domain, defended Nichinan Castle in Kyoto and Kofu Castle in Yamanashi prefecture. The shogunate was ultimately overthrown, ushering in the Meiji period with Emperor Meiji at the helm, and sweeping reforms and so-called modernization of Japan began to occur. Towards the end of the Boshin War, forces loyal to the shogunate fled to the north of Honshu, Japan's main island, and then latterly to Hokkaido. They declared Hokkaido to be the Republic of Ezo, and it's during this stage that a daring battle was waged between the forces loyal to the shogunate and the imperial forces, the Battle of Miyako Bay. Yes, the very Miyako that I lived in until 2023, and indeed the bay that I looked out on an almost daily basis. The battle was the result of the shogunate's forces attempting to seize the flagship of the imperial forces, the Kotetsu, which was en route north to fight the shogunate's forces. Sailing with the US flag, the shogunate's forces made their way to Miyako, where the imperial forces were anchored in a daring attempt to take over the Kotetsu and put the imperial forces on the back foot. But the mission was fraught with issues and ultimately failed, the result being that the imperial forces were able to sail northwards unhindered, and eventually the resulting Battle of Hakodate brought an end to the short-lived Republic of Ezo, and therefore sealed the imperial court's rule over all of Japan, ushering in the Meiji era in which Japan would rapidly change and begin to industrialize. In a small part, the Obi Domain played its role in establishing the foundations of modern Japan, being allied to the Satsuma Domain, who at the time were very much supporting the Meiji Restoration.